Okay, Alan, can you start telling us a bit about yourself, please?
Thank you, Peter. I did a PhD at UMIST in 1966 to 69, and at 1971, I found myself at Forest School, a teacher of chemistry, teaching that particular young man shown on the screen, Peter there. I normally conclude my talks by thanking Peter for the oversight of this sequence, but I've got other people to thank at the end of my talk. So I'll thank you now, Peter, for the initiative of starting this series of talks pre-lockdown and continuing until today. So,
Okay, thank you very much, Alan, for that. And I think we're pretty well all here now. So could you please start giving your talk about TB, the history of TB?
this is a talk I gave in October at Burlington House, part of the conference on chemistry, medicine, and history. This is me, where I am now affiliated to the University of Derby, and I'm also affiliated to the historical group, having resigned from its committee in December. But prior to that, I was a member of the committee for 25 years, and I've been a member of the group for about 40 years. We start with some news headlines, which I gleaned from the Sun of all newspapers for the October talk. The Sun believes that alarmist headlines sell newspapers, and we had a selection there of very alarmist headlines about the rise in TB cases. London, the TB capital of the Western world. Like a good lecturer, I wanted to revise my talk for this presentation, so I again turned to newspapers for a more up-to-date view, and this time it's from the Mail Online. The first paragraph, apart from coughing up blood, a symptom of the TB of the lungs, it's rather low-key. But those of you who know the Mail Online will know it soon went into its usual belief in that most of our problems was caused by immigration. So here we have some quotes from the 14th of April this year from the Mail Online. And we have two slides here. One, Brock the Badger, and the other, Brian May, the astrophysicist and pop star singer. He has a particular interest in saving badgers' lives because at present the country's policy is to exterminate them because they are vectors for the disease bovine tuberculosis, which can transmit to humans and cause TB in the population. This provoked a letter in the Times from Peter Davis, in which he said that TB is still a killer, 1.3 million deaths worldwide, but focus please on the number of deaths in the UK last year, 350. We'll come back to figures like this later on. This is my own very slight brush with TB. You can see me sat on the front row towards the middle wearing glasses, but focus instead on the young man at the left with the arrow pointing to him. because apart from him, all the boys and young men in that class went on to study in the sixth form, but Fred, as we called him, went into the services instead. And there, as part of his medical tests, was found to be suffering from tuberculosis, which meant that the entire class had to be tested for TB. And we lined up with our shoulders bared to be injected with this fearsome machine. And then 3 weeks later, the TB nurse returned and examined our shoulders to see whether or not there were pimples or pustules at the injection site. And in that case, it showed the body had some immunity against the disease. Fortunately, we all passed. It was indeed a killer until the TB remedies were introduced, and I've just put a few people there who are known to have died from tuberculosis. The top line are scientists and engineers: Schrödinger, Fresnel, Mendeleev, and Bell. And the bottom line, non-scientists, we've got Chopin, D.H. Lawrence, George Orwell, and Florence Nightingale. Look at these figures. Look at these figures. TB may have killed a quarter of the adult population in Europe in the 19th century. A quarter. Between 1851 and 1910, 4 million died from TB in England and Wales alone. And if you died between the age of 20 and 24 in Britain, half of you would have died from TB. These are truly horrendous figures. We have at the bottom there a girl, a young woman, possibly succumbing to TB, because although it was a dread disease and a feared disease, it seemed to have some form of romantic attachment. The victim developed a pale skin, red lips, a bodily thinness, which in those days was thought to be attractive still, and gradually detachment and then wasting away. And those of you who've seen the opera La Bohème will remember Mimi, the tragic heroine there. And often I have to say, when I've seen performances, she is far from wasting away, belting out Puccini's arias for us. What was the treatment? Well, we shall see shortly there was a host of ineffective chemical remedies, but probably the one that was most widely tried was to incarcerate the patient for 6 months or more in a dedicated hospital. These sanatoria started in Germany in 1854, came to the UK in 1892, and by 1950, most large towns had its own TB sanatorium. I live in central Derbyshire, and within a 13-mile radius of where I am now sat, I can count 4 TB hospitals. They were predicated on the belief that the TB germ was allergic to sunshine. So these patients were given maximum sunshine, and I have to say, plenty of rest and a good diet. It was thought that dry air was particularly beneficial at high altitude, and then rest to an obsessive degree. And trying to introduce some science into the treatment, they would measure the patient's temperature. And if the temperatures were rising, showing that the tuberculosis germ was active, yet more rest will be prescribed. patients forbidden to clean their own teeth, forbidden to have visitors for fear they excite them. And I could have put a plea to any people who are inclined to do some research in this. Something needs to be written about these regimes in sanatoria, because they'd more or less disappeared by the mid-50s. So patients who were subjected to a regime within these hospitals need to be interviewed and their recollections written down for us. On the right there, we've got the book The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, a novel which he began in 1912 and eventually published in 1926. And he paints very accurately what was like in these large dedicated TB sanatoriums. If you haven't read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, I can recommend it. Did incarcerating patients in a sanatorium do any good? Well, possibly. It was possibly better than any other treatment that was available, including the ineffective chemistry and chemicals given in the form of drugs. We've got some figures here at the Brompton Hospital, where patients diagnosed in the period 1858 to 1965, if they came from a poor working class background, their life expectancy was less than 4 years. But if they came from a wealthy background, and this shows the benefit of good nourishment, then these patients had a life expectancy of between 8 and 10 years. So let's turn to sanatoria. And I think some American figures here show that for a 10-year survival rate, about a third of the patients survived. But if you put the patient in a sanatorium, then about 2/3 of the patients survived. But of course, these figures are suspect, because for a start, the sanatoria would not admit patients for whom there was no hope for survival. Secondly, you had to come from a fairly wealthy background to be admitted to a sanatorium. Certainly, poorer families could not afford to lose their wage-earning father or mother, and the poorer families could not get living help to help families once their mother was put away in the hospital. So one has to regard these figures with some suspicion. Since I gave the talk in October, I've done a bit more research on it, and I came up with the Nazi view of the disease. Firstly, that the disease was largely incurable, true, but it was infectious, true. It could spread to good Aryans, true. And any form of treating it was going to be a financial drain on the state. What solution did the Nazis come up with? They came up with these mobile X-ray machines, the X-ray Storm Battalion, sent out by the SS headquarters. And if we look at in red, they used these mobile mass X-ray buses to identify the sufferers, who were later executed by shooting. And Helen Bynum in 2012 suggested that some 100,000 victims were killed by the Nazis because they had TB as they advanced into the Ukraine. That's an assertion I need to check, because it was new to me when I first read it, and I haven't had it confirmed since. The problem in treating the disease with drugs is that it has an undulating nature. There are periods where it appears to be in retreat and the patient's getting better. And then there are periods when this getting better relapses into periods of profound ill health. And too often, a novel treatment matches a period of improvement, and that will be taken up with the belief that that will be a way of curing the disease. These false dawns led to treatments that initially proved promising, but in the end were beset with false hopes. Largely, they were predicated on the belief that the TB germ, apart from disliking fresh air, didn't like smells. So we have in the list of drugs that were administered to the patients, camphor, iodoform, creosote as an inhalation of the wine, eucalyptus, and believe it or not, hydrocyanic acid. And then there were other treatments. Frederick Soddy of isotope fame, suggested that radon might be inhaled and that might see off the tuberculosis tubercle. Hypnotism, potassium carbonate as a homeopathic treatment. Then two major surgical treatments, both predicated on the belief that you had to rest the lung. So you introduced air in the lung wall to collapse the lung, the pneumothorax, or you could actually remove the ribs and cause the ribs to collapse, and then the lung to collapse, and allegedly rest the lung. You could possibly be touched by the king, a treatment that went out in the time really of Charles II. But I will say, if Camilla happens to get scrofula or TB of the lymph glands of the neck, she should be touched by Charles III and be all right. And then we've got one treatment that actually worked, the Finsen lamp, that would cure TB of the skin, used from 1895, the first effective treatment against any form of TB, and the person who invented it got the Nobel Prize for his discovery. And then we've got a summary of what I published in the newsletter of the Royal Society of Chemists Historical Group. That's a summary written, I think, by me and Peter some years ago. I'll just let you read that. Let it go on. So to summarize what I said before, all the remedies being used, sanatoria possibly, certainly the range of chemical remedies were ineffectual. Sometimes the body could cure itself with good nourishment and fresh air, but mainly the treatments were to alleviate the symptoms of the dreadful cough that was accompanied TB of the lungs. But the 20th century was a century of chemotherapy. In fact, three major discoveries were made that had some diseases on the run. Each of these discoveries was, I must emphasize because of the audience here, a chemical discovery. And there might be one round the corner, as yet undiscovered, that might fight tuberculosis. Where do we start? Well, we'll start just before the dawn of the 20th century with Paul Ehrlich, whom I regard as the father of chemotherapy. He was obsessed with the newly discovered synthetic dyes, and he used them against various diseases, in particular malaria, because the malaria parasite would take up one dye, methylene blue, in sufficient amounts to poison it and kill it, whereas the patient suffering from malaria, although might be tinted blue, would not die from the treatment. So giving the patient a good dose of methylene blue would see off malaria, but in fact the patients didn't like it because quinine was widely available and had the bonus of not turning your urine to the color of writing ink. But the major discovery from Ehrlich came in 1910 when he discovered salvarsan, an arsenical that would cure the scourge of syphilis. Some 20 years later, Lamarck discovered Contosil, which could see off in good cases pneumonia and purple fever. And then we had Fleming's 1928 discovery of penicillin, which was developed effectively by Florey and co-workers and became available in 1944. And that would see off what I would call the ococcal diseases, are listed there, and also others, including diphtheria. And I can remember just about in my very early childhood, in the 1950s, diphtheria was still a disease in children to be feared. As we're chemists, we might as well have some chemical structures. Ehrlich thought that his salvarsan was based on an arsenic double bond, similar to the nitrogen double bonds in azo compounds, but in fact it's now thought to be a mixture of ring compounds. Contosil, you can see on the right there, has the N double bond, a bright red dye. And then we've got penicillin, the structure at the bottom there, which, well, the chemists could manipulate it by changing the group R on the left, and that would make it, for example, withstand the acidity of the stomach. So there are two ways we might start looking for a treatment for tuberculosis. We could use the Ehrlich approach and hope somewhere on the shelves of some chemist there was an organic chemical which could battle the disease, much as salvarsan battles syphilis. Or we could use a Fleming-Florey approach and see what chemicals we can extract from nature and see if they too might attack the disease. We'll start with the second. We go to René Dubos, who was working at the Rockefeller Institute, who in 1930 was investigating soil-living bacilli, which could dissolve the cellulose sheath that surrounded the agent that caused pneumonia. And it had some success. But then he stopped. Why didn't he continue? He looked at mice and showed it had some effectiveness, but no one seems to have explained why he moved off into other things. Was his extract too toxic to try on humans? Did his money run out as for research funding? Some people suggested that with the advent of the sulfonamides, this was thought to be the way ahead for drug discovery, but in fact the dates don't match for that. But we have to say he could have extended the work but didn't. However, it was taken up a few years later by an ambitious researcher, Salman Waxman, working at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And he took the Dubot idea and ran with it. He had a collection of soil living molds, would extract them and see which will work specifically against tuberculosis. And he found one. He found actinomycin. This will work against the germ in a test tube, but was believed to be too toxic for human use. However, it spurred him on to make further discoveries. His main co-worker was Albert Schatz, and with him, he, or Albert Schatz maintains, Schatz himself, isolated streptomycin. This was safe in humans up to a degree. It was certainly effective against TB, and in 1945, it was used against patients, the world's most effective treatment against tuberculosis. No longer would patients have to take glassfuls of creosoted wine in the hope it would improve them. But there was a severe problem with streptomycin. The range for dosage was very narrow. Too much, and your hearing was irreversibly damaged. Too little, and you appeared to recover, but then if you stopped the treatment, the disease would come back, and this time streptomycin wouldn't cure it, and the patients died. If we look at the regime, it was fearsome and unpleasant. The patient would be injected with streptomycin, relatively large amounts, as half a gram for an injection, twice a day in the deep muscle for 2 months, and then for further 2 years, 6 injections per week. And if you tired of these painful injections, you perceived that no longer had you the night sweats or coughing up blood characterized by tuberculosis, if you perceive that you are cured and stop the treatment, you stop the injections, yes, after a while the disease would come back, and this time no amount of injections would enable you to recover. As I say at the bottom there, and the patients died. Moving to the other strand, what I would call the Ehrlich approach. One observation that people made was that the scars from TB infections were usually located in the upper parts of the lung. This implied they were active where the oxygen concentration was the highest. So we had Frederick Bernheim here, who decided to investigate this and produce a method for assessing the growth of the tuberculosis bacillus in the presence of oxygen. He could either measure the growth via the oxygen consumption or the production of CO2. And he decided, having got a method for assessing the growth of the bacillus, to add various nutrients to cause the growth to increase. Ideally, he argued from the x-rays I had showed in the previous slide, then nutrients that were rich in oxygen might be beneficial to the growth of the TB bacillus. And indeed, he was successful. He found three simple species, benzaldehyde, benzoic acid, and salicylic acid, each of which would appear to nourish the TB bacillus and encourage it to grow. Then the idea was picked up by Jürgen Lehmann, who wondered whether or not to extend these molecules, to elaborate them, to tweak them, so they might simultaneously nourish the bacillus and poison it. And he took his idea to a company called Ferrosan, whose interest was mainly in manufacturing dietary iron supplements, one of which was called iodozan, used in cases of anemia, and I suppose that the paleness of the skin of the tuberculosis sufferer, they might turn to a compound like iodozan to cure them or to alleviate their symptoms. But he took the idea to this company, and they were prepared to fund his research, essentially looking for a compound that would nourish the bacillus and poison it. And he decided to look at salicylic acid, and he tried 60 derivatives, including the nitro. Nitro didn't work very well, but he had success with 4-amino-salicylic acid. The oxygen functions, he argued, would nourish the bacillus, and the NH2 in the molecule would poison it. So in the box there, we've got salicylic acid and the compound here, the Bernheim compound, 4-amino-salicylic acid, para-amino-salicylic acid. Some authors say it's difficult to make. It's a 6-step sequence from benzene. The problem is that the yields for each of the steps is less than 100%. So you end up from your starting material, either benzene or dinitrobenzene, only a small amount of the PAS, the para-amino-salicylic acid. And that's a pity, because you need a hell of a lot of it for patient use. The poor patient has to be given 20 grams a day, which he or she must swallow. It is vomit inducing in terms of repulsive flavor. So the technique was put it in those little rice paper sachets, which you and I might remember used to contain sherbet. You took these sachets, you moistened them in water until they became floppy, and then you had to gulp them down whole without bursting them. And then when you'd had success, you'd have to take 4 or 5 more. And like the streptomycin regime, you had to persevere for up to 2 years to be cured. If you stopped early, then the chances are the disease would come back, and then you would get a drug-resistant form of the disease and you would die. However, in the early 1950s, the notion became that they could take the two drugs together. Did that improve matters? Answer, yes. We've seen here in, I think, 1915, how it works, this para-aminosalicylic acid. We've got small molecules at the top of this slide there, which construct with a unit derived from para-aminobenzoic acid that is reduced with dihydrofolate reductase. You can see the second ring on the left there at the top gets reduced, and that produces a molecule that can be incorporated in the bacillus. However, if you use para-aminosalicylic acid, you introduce an extra OH group. The dihydrofolate reductase cannot operate on that. So the sequence that leads to the tuberculosis bacillus at the bottom there has been blocked, and the patient gets cured. I mentioned just a few moments ago that the disease requires 18 to 24 months of treatment to prevent recurrence. And the notion occurred to people in the early 50s that if you treat them with both drugs, then there's a chance of a more rapid success. And this slide here, this table on the right, is probably the most important one I have to show in this presentation. So let's blow it up and concentrate on the solid black area. That's the patient deaths. And we're looking essentially at 100 patients in each group, treating patients by bed rest only in, say, a sanatorium or at home. Then some 30 of the 100 patients would have died within 6 months of being developing the disease. However, if you treat the patients with para-aminosalicylic acid, the second one down, those 30 patients have been reduced to about 5. Treating the patients with streptomycin alone, the patient number having died is about 10. And in combination, strep and PAS, in a relatively small amount, 10 grams per day per patient, you've got 2 patients dying. And given the full dose of para-aminosalicylic acid, 20 grams, and strep, then the patients, there's only one of the cohort has died. So we've reduced from 30 odd deaths from the conventional pre-war treatment of bed rest in a sanatorium or wherever to 1 death with this combined treatment in the 6 months. Of course, for true cure, you'll have to continue the treatment beyond the 6 months, but I think that shows the effectiveness of the combined treatment. The third strand is from what I would call the Prontosil approach. That drug itself is marginally effective at high doses against tuberculosis. Not recommended, but it would have a slight effect. So, of course, what do? You try and manipulate the structure to make it better. Now, it was known that prontosil in the gut is reduced and ends up as sulfanilamide. So that molecule on the top right is elaborated to see if it can be made more and more effective in the fight against tuberculosis. Sulfothiazole is better, and promazole quite a bit better, particularly against miliary and meningitis tuberculosis. Not terribly good against lung tuberculosis, but good enough to go into medical practice. You can see a connection really between all the molecules on the screen as one is elaborated into the other. And then we come to tibione. Now, tibione is thought to be connected to promazole, but in fact, comparing the two molecules, there's little similarity apart from containing the same types of atoms. However, it's interesting to know that this is the first example of a hydrazine-like function within a curative molecule. The NHN there. I remember phenyl hydrazine at the bottom of the slide there. One of the few organic molecules that terrified me. I can remember working with it and coming out in the most appalling rash on my hands having handled it. So goodness knows what it would have done had I gulped some down. Can it be tamed? Can it be tamed and elaborated into a drug? Well, it's been known by some other workers that if you looked at the blood of tubercular patients, it was found to be low in nicotinic acid. This provoked a chemotherapy. So if you could bulk up the nicotinic acid concentration in patients, it might have a curative effect. And it was found that the use of nicotinamide as an oral pill could bulk up the nicotinic acid-like function in the stomach and in the blood, and that would be slightly effective against TB. And certainly the amide function made it palatable, it didn't cause gastric upset. So the question is, could they combine the nicotinic acid function and the hydrazine function? And they could. 1952, working with isonicotinonic acid, we've got the molecule isoniazid, and this is a game changer. It's been used ever since then in the treatment of TB and is still used today. More modern drugs, which I'm not going to talk about, are rifampicin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol. And indeed, if you are diagnosed with tuberculosis today, the regime will be 2 months of treatment with all those drugs, the rifampicin, the isoniazid, the pyrazinamide, and the ethambutol, and then 4 months of treatment with isoniazid and rifampicin, and then assuming the patient takes some pills as prescribed and continues for the whole 6 months and hasn't picked up a drug-resistant strain, she or he will no longer fall victim to the captain of death. And there we have a patient, lady patient, looking victorious after her course of treatment, and the doctor with his stethoscope in the background looking rather pleased with himself. But we must remember that the spade work in curing this lady of her TB was not done by the gentleman with the stethoscope. It was done in all those laboratories. with researcher after researcher, white coat, quick fit apparatus, making molecule after molecule, as examples of molecules and substances were made for testing on patients with the hope that they would cure this scourge. So most of the work done until the 50s, male chemists in white coats. However, if we turn to a research laboratory today, perhaps the male chemist has been supplanted by female research chemists. Well, this comes to the end of my story about the chemists' fight against tuberculosis. But I have to thank, first of all, the University of Derby for email and library facilities, but two individuals, two doctors no longer with us, who I suppose around about 1995, 2000, tilted my research from the pure history of chemistry into where chemistry and medicine and history come together. David Zook on the left and Keith Pooley on the right. And my final thanks go to some people, my parents, in fact, on the right, on the left there, who in 1955 bought me a chemistry set. And there's me, age 10, doing my chemistry with a friend. And that started me off on a career which I have found very, very satisfying ever since. Thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that once again wonderful talk with all those particular insights. I've got a few questions. Well, not very many questions here, but I have a few questions here. The first thing I would like to say is not really a question, but around 2000, I think it was in 2000, I was at a sort of celebration at the National Institute for Medical Research, which no longer exists, but at that time was at Mill Hill. It's now part of the Francis Crick Institute in King's Cross. And I was I'm not quite sure why we were having that particular celebration. I thought it was the 100th anniversary of the NMLR, but I don't think it was. Anyway, I was introduced to this incredible, fragile old man who had just then, I think, become 100. And his name was Philip Darcy Hart. And he was celebrated by those there for his work on the conquest of TB, because apparently he was one of the people who introduced the combined therapy into the NHS in the late 1940s and 1950s. He originally started working in Wales on black lung disease and then moved into the treatment of TB. And he eventually died in 2006 at the age of 106. So he had a good innings. My question to you, Alan, is that is there any connection here between TB and AIDS in the 1980s?
I can give you a story from my past. I recounted it at the October meeting. In the early 1980s, I knew a chap who was, dare I say, unfortunately, incredibly handsome. And he was attractive both to men and women. And over the time, he was known to be a bit of a Lothario and have lots and lots of partners of both sexes. Fortunately, keeping a long distance from me. And there was a gap of about 6 months when I didn't see him. And then when I saw him again, he'd become very, very ill. His face, and the flesh had drawn away. He was seriously ill. And knowing what his proclivities were, I wondered, but I just advised him to go and seek medical help urgently. And which he did, or had been doing. And then some months or two later, I saw him again, And he said to me, Alan, he said, I did as you suggested. I saw my doctor, and I've had a diagnosis. It's tuberculosis, and it can be cured, can't it? And I thought, well, yes, it can, but it sounds to me as if your immunity is now so compromised, the tuberculosis is going to win. And yes, he did succumb to tuberculosis that was caused by the fact that he had HIV and AIDS. Today, if you are found to be suffering from HIV, then you're going to be monitored very carefully to see whether or not a course of treatment against tuberculosis is required. But there are drugs now that can fight AIDS and drugs that can fight TB. So the patient now, the outlook is quite a lot better.
So isn't AIDS connected typically with Kaposi disease? Isn't Kaposi disease a type of tuberculosis?
And have a look at it. The Kaposi is a form of skin cancer, isn't it? But whether or not it has a tubercular background, I don't know.
Okay, okay. Okay, somebody Alan Cook has commented here. If I recall correctly, there is a synergy between AIDS and TB, one enhancing the other, known as the deadly duo.
Yeah, the best way to go to investigate this is to go onto Google Scholar and put in the two diseases there and look at some of the papers there, which I was doing, in fact, this morning before this talk. I had read somewhere that in America, if you were diagnosed with that, you would start a course of anti-tuberculosis drugs, even though there was no indication of you suffering from TB, just in case. I think that regime now is frowned upon.
Well, you do what you can, I suppose, at the time. I've got a question here about, okay, tuberculosis was a major killer in the 19th century. Were there any other disease what was even more of a killer, or was tuberculosis at the top of the tree, as it were?
I think syphilis was certainly high up there, probably more so. I mean, the figures, if you can believe them, for syphilis are frightening. And I think I've written a paper on the history of the chemotherapy of syphilis. So if you want a final talk, Peter, there you are.
Yeah, okay. Are you offering to give that talk, or?
Well, the other talk, which if I were to give a final one, is already prepared, and that is to look at World War One and chemistry, because we talk about World War One being the chemist's war, and it's the contribution is through high explosives, not poison gases. So I have a lecture already prepared, which I've given here, there, and everywhere, on the First World War in chemistry. But if asked, I could do one on the treatment of syphilis.
Well, okay, well, we'll talk about that, Alan.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many more of these I want to give, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, Alan Crooks also made the comment that the astrological physician Simon Foreman came up with the eagle in 1583 to be precise, came up with the idea of the eagle stone. I don't know what the eagle stone was made of, but it was supposed to cure King's evil, Corpula in other words. Although Anne Boleyn used it to ensure safe childbirth. So obviously it might have helped with childbirth, it didn't help with beheading.
No. That's something I haven't heard of in the remedies for TB. I like the notion of giving HCN, hydrocyanic acid, to stop them feeling sick. You have to judge the dose very,
Seems
very
amazing.
carefully.
It seems amazing, doesn't it? Incredible, huh? Anyway, Alan made the comment that eagle stones are hollow stones that rattle. They're popularly known as A-types. So the stone with a hollow with a bit of a middle in them. I have come across those. Okay, then I think that's about it. And thank you very much again, Alan. Hello, we've got one more comment here. I can confirm that TB sanatoria was still in use, but not for TB in Manchester in 1969-73, because I did 3 years postgraduate research in blood clotting at a converted sanatorium in Withington Hospital in South Manchester. Not an
Well,
ideal conversion because of the glass houses, freezing in winter, and greenhouse hot in summer. And incidentally, I can add to that because in fact I was born in a former TB ward.
yeah, Papworth Hospital, famous for for heart transplants, was a TB hospital. I think Oswestry Hospital, famous for orthopedic patients, again was a TB hospital. So many of them have been repurposed.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Well, in my particular case, it was then turned into a car park, and then the hospital was sold off for housing. So it now disappeared completely. It was originally a workhouse, actually, um,
Yeah,
years ago. Anyway, well, thank you again. Thank you once again, Alan.
right.
Wonderful
Farewell,
talk.
all. Farewell.
And Nick Month, well, not Nick Month, because Nick Month we're having a well-deserved rest. And in September, the third Tuesday of September, which I think is, let me just double check, the third Tuesday in September is the 16th. We'll be having a talk by John Powers on Michael Combron and the development of brewing in the 18th century. Michael Combron was a very important figure in early brewing, and in a way, it's a kind of commemoration of our former member who's now passed away, Ray Anderson, who was interested in history of brewing. John wasn't able to give his talk earlier in the year because unfortunately he had a family issue. But he can be coming back to us in September. He's always very good. Please join us again in September after your summer rest. And thank you very much all, one and all, for coming today. Goodbye for now then, everybody.